Meet Evelyn Parker, a 67-year-old grandmother who has lived most of her life in a quiet suburb of Portland, Oregon. Her days are filled with memories of her late son and the warmth of the little house where every corner still whispers of the past. To her neighbors, Evelyn may appear as just another elderly widow, but behind her gentle smile is a woman carrying both grief and extraordinary resilience. When her granddaughter Emma is left in her care one cold evening, a terrifying secret begins to unravel, pushing Evelyn to confront not only her own fears, but also the silence of an entire community. This story is part of Grandma's Final Chapter, a channel dedicated to telling emotional, thought-provoking stories about older adults, stories of courage, dignity, and strength in the face of betrayal, loss, and change. We believe aging is not about fading away, but about reclaiming independence, protecting family, and inspiring future generations. If this story touches your heart, don't just watch, become part of our community. Like this video, subscribe to Grandma's Final Chapter, and share in the comments where you are watching from. Every interaction helps us bring more meaningful stories each day, reminding seniors everywhere that life's later years can be filled with purpose, pride, and joy. The night had fallen heavy over the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. The tall pine trees swayed softly in the wind, and the only light that reached Evelyn Parker's small wooden house came from the pale glow of the porch lamp and the occasional sweep of a car passing on the distant road. At 67 years old, Evelyn had grown used to the quiet. Her house was filled with the echoes of years gone by. Photographs on the wall of her late son David, the faint scent of lavender she kept tucked inside drawers, the creaking floorboards that spoke more loudly than the television she rarely turned on. Solitude had become her constant companion, not unwelcome, but heavy. That evening, her old life was disturbed when Melissa, her former daughter-in-law, arrived at her doorstep. Melissa's hair was tied too tightly, her eyes darting down the street as if she feared being followed. She pushed forward her 8-year-old daughter Emma with hurried words about a late shift at work. Evelyn did not argue. She took Emma's small hand, warm and fragile, and led her inside while Melissa lingered at the door, repeating, "You do not mind, do you?" over and over, until Evelyn nodded just to reassure her. Moments later, Melissa's figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving Evelyn with a lingering unease that prickled her skin. Inside, the house glowed softly. Evelyn had prepared chicken soup, but Emma barely touched it. She sat curled on the couch, clutching her worn teddy bear named Mr. Buttons, eyes fixed on the screen, but not really watching. Evelyn tried to speak, to coax her into chatter, but every attempt fell flat. The girl's silences carried a weight too heavy for her age. Later that night, Evelyn made up a bed beside her own, just as she had when her son was a boy. Emma lay quietly, back against the wall, Mr. Buttons pressed tightly to her chest. Evelyn whispered goodnight and watched her granddaughter's chest rise and fall. She hoped the child would sleep peacefully. She herself did not rest. Each tick of the clock reminded her of the absence of her son and the strangeness of Melissa's behavior. It was close to midnight when Evelyn heard the first broken sound, a whimper, so faint she thought it might have come from the wind. Then a sob. She sat up, heart pounding. Emma's small body trembled beneath the covers. Her voice cracked through the darkness, frail and terrified. "Grandma, I am so scared. Do not leave me." Evelyn reached out, stroking the child's damp hair. "I am here, sweetheart. You are safe with me." For a moment, Emma seemed to calm, sinking back into uneasy sleep. Evelyn lay awake, eyes on the ceiling, worry pressing into her chest. She thought it was over. But just before dawn, when the first gray light seeped through the thin curtains, Emma stirred again. She sat up suddenly, clutching Mr. Buttons, her eyes wide and wet with unshed tears. Her voice came out as a whisper, as if the walls themselves might hear. "Grandma, Mommy told me I cannot tell you what I saw at home." The words froze Evelyn's breath. She knelt beside the bed, her hand trembling as she brushed a strand of tangled hair from Emma's forehead. "You can tell me anything, my love. What did you see?" Emma bit her lip, her whole body tense with fear. She looked down at her bear as if drawing courage from the worn stitches. Then she leaned close, her voice breaking. "There is a little girl locked in the basement of our house. She cries all the time. She says her hands hurt." The words slammed into Evelyn like ice water poured over her skin. She felt her stomach twist, her pulse thunder in her ears. For an instant, she could not move. The spatula she had left on the nightstand slid to the floor with a metallic clang, echoing in the small bedroom like a cruel confirmation of the horror just spoken. Emma's eyes filled with tears. She buried her face into Evelyn's chest, trembling like a bird caught in a storm. Evelyn wrapped her arms around the child, but inside she felt the ground shifting beneath her. What could this mean? A child locked away. Melissa's nervous eyes at the door. Emma's nightmares and silences. Evelyn whispered, more to herself than to the little girl in her arms. "God help me. What is happening inside that house?" Her body shook. She felt both fragile and fierce. Fragile because her heart ached with disbelief and fear. Fierce because some instinct deeper than grief, older than loneliness, told her she had to act. She could not ignore Emma's whisper, no matter what others might say. The first rays of morning filtered into the room, golden and cold, illuminating the child's frightened face. Evelyn knew nothing would be the same again. If you have ever heard a secret that froze your heart the way mine did that night, please subscribe and tell me where you are watching from. Together, we can make sure voices like Emma's are never silenced. The night air in Portland carried a chill that seeped into Evelyn Parker's bones. Her old wooden house, tucked at the end of a quiet lane, groaned faintly as the wind threaded itself through cracks in the walls. Outside, the street lamp at the corner cast a pale yellow circle of light, and the tall maple trees swayed, their branches scratching against one another with a whispering sound that reminded Evelyn of restless voices. Shadows danced across the porch, fragile and trembling like broken memories. She had lived in this house for more than 40 years. Its wooden beams had held her joys and sorrows. The kitchen window still bore faint scratches where her late husband once hung bird feeders. The faded rug at the doorway was older than her son David had been when he first learned to walk. The house had never seemed menacing until tonight. Now the same familiar creaks felt like warnings, and the silence between each gust of wind pressed against Evelyn's ears like a threat. Melissa stood on the porch, refusing to cross the threshold. Evelyn noticed the way her daughter-in-law's eyes darted back and forth down the street, like a hunted animal scanning for predators. Her hand clutched the strap of her handbag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The small tremor in her fingers betrayed more than nervousness. It was fear. The kind of fear that does not come from being late to work or tired from a long day. This was something deeper, something secret. "You don't mind keeping Emma tonight, do you?" Melissa's voice cracked slightly. She repeated the question a second time, and then again, as if Evelyn's nod of reassurance was never enough. Evelyn studied her face carefully. The woman who once laughed in her kitchen while learning to roast chilies with David now looked like a stranger. Her lips were pressed tight, her skin pale in the porch light. Every gesture seemed rehearsed but unstable, as though she were forcing herself to remain in control. Emma, only 8 years old, pressed herself against her mother's leg, clinging to her frayed teddy bear. Mr. Buttons looked as weary as the child herself, one button eye missing, the fabric worn thin from years of desperate hugs. Emma's eyes lifted toward Evelyn with a pleading look that pierced through the grandmother's chest. It was not the shy glance of a child who felt awkward in a grandparent's home. It was a silent cry for safety. Evelyn felt it like a physical pull, as if Emma's fear was begging to be taken inside. Melissa leaned down and kissed the top of Emma's head. "Sleep well, sweetheart. I will be back for you tomorrow." Her words trembled, too soft, and yet Evelyn heard them clearly. Then Melissa straightened, and in that instant, her eyes met Evelyn's. The look lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough. There was no warmth, no shared bond of two women once connected by love for the same man. Instead, Evelyn saw desperation and something else she could not name. It was as if Melissa was silently shouting at her, warning her, or maybe pleading for help. The moment passed, and Melissa turned quickly, walking down the porch steps and vanishing into the dark street without a backward glance. The sound of her heels tapping against the pavement echoed too loudly in Evelyn's ears, until it faded into the night. For a long moment, Evelyn remained still on the porch, her hand resting lightly on Emma's shoulder. The wind brushed against her cheeks, carrying with it the faint scent of damp leaves and distant rain. She shivered, not only from the cold, but from the feeling that something invisible had entered her life, something that would not easily leave. Inside, the house seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn led Emma through the doorway, closing the wooden door behind them, but the air remained unsettled. The shadows outside still lingered in her mind, along with the weight of Melissa's haunted glance. Evelyn had faced loneliness, the loss of her husband, and the unbearable grief of burying her only son. But what she felt now was different. It was not sorrow, it was dread. And dread had a way of settling deep in the bones, colder than any wind slipping through the cracks of her old wooden home. She bent down and kissed Emma on the forehead. "You are safe here, my love," she whispered, though she was not sure she believed it. Emma clutched Mr. Buttons tighter and nodded, her small face pale in the lamplight. She did not speak, but her eyes said everything. That silent exchange between three people, the anxious daughter-in-law, the frightened child, and the grieving grandmother, was more powerful than any words. Evelyn knew it was the beginning of something dark. A secret had been placed on her doorstep along with Emma, and Melissa's fleeting look had made it clear. This was no ordinary night. The sound of Emma's quiet breathing filled the room, but Evelyn could not sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hands clasped together, staring at the framed photograph on the dresser. The photo was of David, her only son, standing tall with a smile that could light up the darkest day. In the picture, Melissa was by his side, radiant and full of warmth, holding a tiny Emma in her arms. Evelyn's heart twisted as she traced their faces with her eyes, remembering what had once been a perfect world. It was not so long ago, she told herself, though the years had blurred together like colors running in the rain. She could still recall the Saturdays when David would bring his little family to the house for dinner. Melissa had been so different then. She used to fill Evelyn's kitchen with laughter as they cooked together, asking questions about recipes and joking about who could make the spiciest stew. Emma, barely learning to walk, would toddle across the living room carpet, her giggles echoing like bells. Evelyn would sit at the table, watching her son lift Emma high into the air, his strong hands making her squeal with delight. Those moments had felt eternal. Then came the night that shattered everything. Evelyn remembered it vividly, for it had carved itself into her soul. It had been raining, the kind of steady Oregon rain that never seemed to stop. She was lying awake, listening to the wind whistle through the trees when the phone rang. The shrill sound had made her sit up with a start. On the other end of the line was a voice she did not recognize, trembling and hesitant, delivering words that would never leave her. There had been an accident. David's car had lost control on the slick road, spun out, and plunged into a ravine. He did not survive. The memory replayed in Evelyn's mind in fragments. The receiver slipping from her hand, the icy floor beneath her knees as she collapsed, the hollow ringing in her ears as if the world itself had gone silent. She had rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. Her son, the man who had been her pride and joy, was gone. The weight of it still pressed against her chest, as though no amount of time could lessen it. At the funeral, the sky wept with her. Melissa stood by the casket, pale and rigid, her face a mask of grief Evelyn could not penetrate. Emma, barely old enough to understand, kept asking where her father was. Evelyn held the child close, whispering that Daddy was in a faraway place, watching over them. But she herself did not believe the words. Nothing could fill the emptiness. After David's death, everything changed. Melissa withdrew into herself. At first, Evelyn thought it was the natural way of grief, that time would bring her daughter-in-law back. But time did not heal Melissa. Instead, she became distant, cold, as though a part of her had been sealed away forever. She stopped visiting as often, speaking less and less when she did. The light in her eyes dimmed. When Evelyn asked if she needed help, Melissa would shake her head and insist she was fine. Yet Evelyn noticed the patterns. Melissa would drop Emma off with vague explanations about work. She spoke of night shifts, of long hours, of responsibilities that kept her away. Each excuse felt thinner than the last, but Evelyn wanted to believe. She wanted to trust that Melissa was doing her best as a mother. Still, the unease grew. Evelyn saw the changes in Emma. The girl became quieter, her once bright laughter fading into silence. She clung more tightly to her teddy bear. She smiled less, avoided questions, and carried herself with a heaviness that no child should know. As the memories passed through Evelyn's mind that night, she felt a realization cut through her grief. The past had not just been shattered by David's death. It had left a fracture that opened into the present. Melissa's transformation, her evasive excuses, her fearful glance on the porch, none of it stood alone. It was all part of a chain, a story that had begun on that rainy night years ago when she lost her son. Her throat tightened as she whispered to the darkened room, "David, what has happened to your family? What is Melissa hiding? What has Emma seen?" The silence answered her like it always did, heavy and merciless. Yet this time it felt different, as if the silence itself was urging her to look deeper, to stop pretending that Melissa's excuses were harmless. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken, a mixture of dread and determination. She understood now that the tragedy of losing David was not the end of her family's story. It was only the beginning of a mystery that had grown quietly in the shadows, waiting for her to uncover it. She turned her gaze back to Emma, curled under the quilt, Mr. Buttons pressed tight against her. The child's face, even in sleep, carried traces of fear. Evelyn's chest ached as she realized that the battle for her granddaughter's safety had already begun, and the darkness that had crept into their lives after David's death was no longer something she could ignore. The past was fractured, but the present demanded answers. Evelyn whispered again, this time to herself, steady and resolute. "I will find out, no matter what it costs." The evening settled heavily inside Evelyn's wooden house. She had prepared dinner with care, a pot of chicken noodle soup that filled the kitchen with the warm aroma of simmering broth and parsley. It was the kind of meal that had always coaxed a smile from her late son David when he was a boy, and later from Emma when she was smaller and carefree. Evelyn placed a steaming bowl in front of her granddaughter, hoping the familiar comfort would open a small door between them, but Emma only stared at it. The spoon lay untouched at her side. Her small fingers clutched Mr. Buttons, the worn teddy bear, as if he alone could protect her. On the television, brightly colored cartoons flashed and chattered, but Emma's eyes did not follow the movement. She seemed locked inside herself, staring past the screen into some hidden world. "Eat a little, sweetheart," Evelyn said softly. "It will make you feel better." The child shook her head. Her lips pressed together, and she pulled the bear closer to her chest. Evelyn felt a pang in her heart. She tried to smile, to hide her worry, but the silence between them was heavy and unnatural. All evening, Emma remained on the couch, curled into the cushions. She did not laugh, did not speak, only watched the shadows shifting across the room as the light faded. Evelyn sat beside her, resisting the urge to press for answers. She knew children often needed time to feel safe, yet every moment stretched the tension inside her chest. Something was terribly wrong. When night finally arrived, Evelyn prepared a small bed beside her own. She tucked Emma under the quilt, smoothed her hair, and kissed her forehead. The child lay quietly, her back against the wall, her teddy bear wedged tightly between her arms. Evelyn whispered, "Good night, my love. You are safe here." But safety did not come easily. Around midnight, Evelyn awoke to a sound that twisted her insides. It was soft at first, a whimper, then a muffled sob. She leaned closer and realized Emma was crying in her sleep, her small body trembling under the quilt. "Grandma," the child whimpered through her dream, her voice broken. "Please do not leave me. I am so scared." Evelyn's throat tightened. She sat up, pulled the girl gently into her arms, and stroked her damp hair. "I am here, darling. I am not going anywhere." Emma did not wake. She clung to her teddy bear even as her tears soaked Evelyn's nightgown. Evelyn held her until the sobs faded, her heart aching with helplessness. The rest of the night was restless. Evelyn lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the old house sounding louder than usual, every shadow stretching too far. Morning light finally seeped through the thin curtains, painting the bedroom with golden stripes. Evelyn rose quietly and went to the kitchen, trying to fill the house with the normal comfort of breakfast. The scent of sizzling eggs and warm toast spread through the small room. She hoped the smell would remind Emma of safety, of love, of mornings when her father was still alive. When Emma shuffled into the kitchen, her hair tangled, her eyes swollen and red, Evelyn forced a bright smile. "Good morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep well?" Emma did not answer. She sank into a chair, Mr. Buttons still clutched against her chest. Evelyn placed a plate in front of her. "I made scrambled eggs and warm milk. Just a little, to start the day." For a moment, it seemed as though Emma might eat. She lifted the fork halfway, then froze. Her small lips parted, and in a voice so faint it was almost lost in the hum of the refrigerator, she whispered, "Grandma, Mommy told me not to tell you what I saw at home." Evelyn stopped mid-motion. The spatula slipped from her hand, clattering against the stove. Her body stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly to face the child, forcing her voice to stay calm, though her heart pounded violently. "Emma," she said gently, kneeling beside her chair. "You can tell me anything. Do not be afraid. What did you see?" Emma's eyes welled with tears. She bit her lip, torn between obedience and the desperate need to release the secret. Finally, she leaned closer, her voice trembling. "There is a little girl locked in the basement of our house. She cries all the time. She says her hands hurt." The words tore through Evelyn like a blade. The room seemed to tilt, the smell of eggs and toast turning sour in her nose. Her mind reeled. A little girl, locked away, crying in pain. The spoon in her hand slipped and struck the tiled floor with a sharp clang that echoed like a verdict. Milk sloshed in the glass beside Emma, spilling across the table in a pale stream. Evelyn's chest tightened as if gripped by an unseen hand. She could hardly breathe. Emma burst into tears, throwing herself into her grandmother's arms, her small body shaking. Evelyn wrapped her tightly, stroking her tangled hair, but her mind raced with questions she could not yet bear to speak aloud. Was Melissa hiding something unthinkable? Could it be true? Or was this the imagination of a frightened child? Yet deep inside, Evelyn already knew. The terror in Emma's eyes, the weight in her voice, the sleepless sobs of the night before. None of it was a game. None of it could be dismissed. As she held her trembling granddaughter, Evelyn whispered, "You are safe with me. I will protect you." But inside, her soul shook with fear. The fracture in her family's past had widened into a chasm, and through it had slipped a secret so dark it made her blood run cold. This was no longer grief or loneliness. This was danger, real and immediate. And Evelyn, fragile as she was, understood she had been chosen to face it. Evelyn Parker could not shake the weight of Emma's words. They clung to her mind like a shadow that refused to loosen its grip. A little girl locked in a basement, hands that hurt, crying that never stopped. No matter how many times Evelyn tried to tell herself it might have been a dream or a child's imagination, the truth pressed harder. Emma's frightened eyes and trembling voice were not born of fantasy. The next morning, Evelyn decided she needed perspective from someone who saw Emma every day. She walked Emma to school, holding her granddaughter's small hand in her own. The gravel path beneath their feet seemed louder than usual, every crunch echoing in Evelyn's ears. Emma said little, her teddy bear tucked under her arm as if she could not face the world without it. When they reached the school, Evelyn asked Emma to join her class, then quietly requested a moment with her teacher, Mrs. Clark. The teacher, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a sharp mind, met her in the staff lounge. The faint smell of chalk dust lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of stale coffee. "Mrs. Clark," Evelyn began, her voice lower than she intended. "I need to ask you about Emma. Has she been different lately?" Mrs. Clark studied her for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. "Yes, I have noticed changes. She has become quieter. Sometimes she sits at her desk and stares off as though she is somewhere far away. When the other children laugh, she does not always join in, and her drawings, well, they worry me." Evelyn's heart skipped. "Her drawings?" Mrs. Clark opened a folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. Each one was filled with crude sketches made in the messy lines of a child, yet there was nothing innocent about them. Evelyn's breath caught as she looked closer. A small figure of a girl stood alone in what looked like a dark room. Around her were jagged black lines, heavy and thick, almost like bars on a cage. "She draws this again and again," Mrs. Clark explained. "The same little figure in a confined space. Sometimes the girl is crying. Sometimes she is holding her arm as if in pain. I tried to ask Emma about it, but she said very little, only that it was someone she knew." Evelyn felt a chill crawl down her spine. Her mind returned instantly to Emma's whisper in the kitchen. A girl in the basement, crying about her hands. The pieces aligned too perfectly to be ignored. She reached out and touched one of the drawings, her fingers trembling. "Thank you," Evelyn whispered, her voice breaking. "You have no idea how much this means." Mrs. Clark placed a hand gently on Evelyn's arm. "I do not know what is happening, but please trust your instincts. Children do not invent these things without reason." The words followed Evelyn as she walked home later that afternoon. The sky was overcast, the wind sharp as it rattled through the branches of the maple trees lining her street. Her thoughts swirled, heavier with every step. Emma's voice, the drawings, the warnings in Melissa's nervous eyes, it all painted a picture too grim to dismiss. As she approached her own yard, she saw her elderly neighbor, Mr. Whitman, standing by the fence. His cane rested against the wooden slats, and his eyes, sharp despite his age, studied her carefully. "You look troubled, Evelyn," he said in his gravelly voice. "Something weighing on you?" Evelyn hesitated. Should she speak? She had known Mr. Whitman for decades, had watched his hair turn from dark to silver. He was the sort of man who noticed everything but rarely commented unless it mattered. His steady gaze urged her to trust him. "Emma told me something," Evelyn began softly, glancing around as if the trees themselves might be listening. "Something I can hardly believe, but then again, I think I have to." Mr. Whitman leaned closer, his brow furrowing. "What did she say?" Evelyn hesitated, then chose her words carefully. "She spoke of another girl, a little one, locked away in Melissa's house." The old man's face grew tight. He shifted on his cane, his voice lowering. "I was afraid of something like that." Evelyn blinked. "You were afraid? What do you mean?" He sighed, his eyes clouded with unease. "I did not want to say anything without cause, but one night last week, I could not sleep. I went outside to sit on my porch. It was late, past midnight. I saw Melissa coming home, but she was not alone." Evelyn's breath caught. Not alone? She was holding the hand of a little girl. Not Emma. This one was smaller, with shorter hair. She looked exhausted, stumbling along in pajamas. Melissa ushered her quickly into the house, looking around like she was afraid someone might see. "I thought it strange at the time, but I convinced myself it must have been a cousin or a friend's child. Now," he paused, shaking his head. "Now, I am not so sure." The world tilted beneath Evelyn's feet. The pieces she had tried to deny were sliding together, forming a picture too horrifying to dismiss. Emma's whisper, the drawings, and now Mr. Whitman's midnight memory. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heartbeat pounding. "So it is true," she murmured, almost to herself. Mr. Whitman placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Be careful, Evelyn. If there is truth in this, it is not something small. It could be dangerous. Evelyn nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She turned toward her house, her mind screaming with questions, her body trembling from the weight of what she had just learned. Two sources, completely separate, pointing to the same terrifying reality: Emma's fragile voice and drawings from the classroom, Mr. Whitman's watchful eyes in the night. The fragments of truth had begun to gather, falling into place like shards of broken glass. For the first time, Evelyn felt not only fear, but a surge of clarity. The past she had endured, the loneliness she had carried, had all led her to this moment. She could no longer pretend. She could no longer comfort herself with the idea that Melissa's behavior was simply grief or exhaustion. Something darker was unfolding, and Evelyn knew she was standing at the edge of it. The scattered clues were no longer scattered. They pointed in one direction, toward the locked basement of Melissa's home. The decision weighed on Evelyn all night. She sat at the small kitchen table with Emma's untouched drawings spread before her, each crude sketch of a lonely figure behind bars gnawing at her conscience. Mr. Whitman's hushed admission echoed in her ears. A girl led into Melissa's house after midnight, a child who was not Emma. The evidence was fragile, like smoke that could vanish with the slightest breeze, but it was all she had. By morning, Evelyn's mind was made up. She gathered the drawings, slipped them into a worn envelope, and walked to the bus stop. Her knees ached with each step, but determination pushed her forward. She clutched the handle of her old leather bag as though it carried the weight of an entire life, and in some ways, it did. The police station in downtown Portland was an aging building with cracked paint on its walls and the faint smell of burnt coffee in the lobby. A young officer behind the desk barely looked up when Evelyn asked to speak to whoever was in charge. After a long pause, he guided her to a back office where Detective Harris sat hunched over a pile of reports. Harris was a man in his 50s, with graying hair at his temples and the weary eyes of someone who had seen too many tragedies. He glanced up as Evelyn entered, then gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "What brings you in, ma'am?" he asked, his voice flat. Evelyn set the envelope down on the desk, her hands trembling. "Detective, I believe a child is in danger. My granddaughter Emma told me something no child should ever say. She said there is a little girl locked in Melissa's basement." Harris frowned, leaning back slightly. "Melissa is your daughter-in-law?" "Yes, my late son David's wife, Emma's mother." Evelyn's voice quivered but held steady. "Emma has been drawing disturbing pictures over and over. A girl trapped in a dark room, behind bars, holding her arm as if in pain. And my neighbor, Mr. Whitman, saw Melissa leading a little girl into the house at midnight. That child was not Emma." She pushed the drawings toward him. Harris leafed through them, his expression unreadable. Finally, he set them down with a sigh. "Mrs. Parker, I understand you are concerned, but children say things. They have wild imaginations. Drawings are not evidence. Neither is the account of an elderly neighbor who caught a glimpse in the dark." Evelyn's heart thudded. "Detective, Emma is terrified. She cries in her sleep. She whispered it to me like it was a secret that burned her. Does that sound like imagination?" Harris shook his head slowly. "I am not dismissing your worry, but legally, I cannot request a search warrant based on this. We need something solid. A missing person report, physical evidence, anything more than the word of a child and a sketchbook." The words hit Evelyn like cold rain. She leaned forward, her voice breaking. "What if there is a girl suffering right now? What if waiting costs her life? Detective, please." But Harris only tapped his pen against the desk. "We will file your report. If anything else comes in, we will review it. That is the best I can offer." Evelyn stood on unsteady legs. The walls of the office seemed to close in on her. She gathered the envelope with trembling hands, but the papers inside felt useless now. "Thank you," she whispered, though bitterness coated her tongue. She left the station, the weight of the rejection crushing her chest. The midday sun was too bright, the air too sharp. As she walked home, whispers seemed to rise around her like gnats in the summer air. By the time she reached the corner market, she could already feel the shift. Familiar faces glanced her way, then quickly looked down. 2 cashiers spoke in hushed voices, just loud enough for her to catch fragments. Poor Evelyn, still grieving David, her mind is not what it used to be. They say she made up a story about Melissa. Imagine accusing your own family like that. Her heart clenched. She wanted to shout, to tell them she had not invented anything, that Emma's words were real, but her throat locked, and the gossip only grew. By evening, the rumors had spread across the neighborhood. A pair of mothers whispered near the playground. A man at the hardware store shook his head and muttered, "That old widow is losing touch. Grief does strange things." When Evelyn stepped out onto her porch, she felt the weight of eyes on her. Curtains twitched, conversations hushed when she walked past. In a single day, she had become what she feared most, the crazy old woman. Inside her home, she sank into the armchair where David's photograph still hung on the wall. His smiling face gazed back at her, frozen in time. Evelyn pressed her hand against the frame, tears blurring her vision. "They think I am delusional," she whispered to her son's picture. "They do not believe me, but you know me, David. You know I would never lie about something like this. There is a child out there crying for help. I cannot let her voice go unheard." Her voice cracked, but her resolve deepened. The world might call her mad, but Evelyn knew the truth was stronger than their whispers. She would not give up, even if it meant standing alone. She closed her eyes, clutching Emma's drawings against her chest. The lines of a frightened child, the memory of Whitman's solemn words, and Emma's trembling whisper were all she had. But they were enough to keep her fighting. And then, with the weight of the silence pressing in from every side, Evelyn whispered to herself, almost as a vow, "If no one else will listen, then I will be the one who carries the truth." What would you do if the whole neighborhood turned its back, but your heart told you a child was crying for help? Share your thoughts below, and remember to subscribe so we can keep telling these stories that matter. The walls of Evelyn's home felt smaller with each passing day. Rumors had wrapped themselves around her like ivy, choking the air. Every errand became an ordeal. Eyes followed her, whispers trailed her steps, and the once familiar neighborhood now seemed like a hostile stage where she was cast as the madwoman. Yet, amidst the silence, there was Rose, her oldest friend, her confidant, the one person who had not allowed gossip to color her heart. Rose arrived one afternoon with a casserole still warm from the oven, setting it on the counter as if to remind Evelyn that kindness still lived in the world. "Let them talk," Rose said firmly, taking Evelyn's hand across the kitchen table. "Truth does not need an audience to exist, but if no one believes you now, you must gather everything you can. Write it down. Every whisper from Emma, every strange look from Melissa, every detail Mr. Whitman shares. Make a record. One day, it will matter." Evelyn nodded slowly. The idea felt like a lifeline. She pulled out an old notebook with a faded blue cover and began scribbling, her shaky handwriting filling the pages with fragments of memory. Emma's sleepless cries, Melissa's pale face at the door, the heavy pause in Detective Harris's office. Rose watched silently, nodding with encouragement. That night, Evelyn sat at the table until her lamp flickered, documenting each piece of the puzzle as though her pen were carving a path through the fog. She felt less powerless with each word. Perhaps this was how she could fight back, not with fists or loud declarations, but with patience and truth. The following evening brought another knock at her door. This time, it was Mr. Whitman. He stood in the shadows of her porch, his cane leaning against the rail, a serious expression carved into his weathered face. "Evelyn," he said in a hushed tone, "there is something you need to see." She ushered him inside, sensing the urgency in his voice. He pulled an old smartphone from his coat pocket, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked the screen. "My nephew manages the convenience store at the corner," he explained. "I asked him to check last week's security cameras. I thought maybe it would confirm what I saw that night. Evelyn, it did." He handed her the phone. Evelyn held her breath as the grainy footage flickered to life. The camera showed the quiet street outside the store in the dead of night. A figure appeared, hurrying along the sidewalk. Melissa. Even in the low resolution, Evelyn recognized her immediately, the same posture, the same cautious glance over her shoulder. But Melissa was not alone. Clutching her hand was a little girl in pajamas far too thin for the chill of midnight. Her hair hung in tangled strands, her steps unsteady as though she could barely keep up. Melissa pulled her forward quickly, almost dragging her, before the two disappeared into the dark edge of the frame toward Melissa's house. Evelyn's chest tightened. The screen blurred as her eyes filled with tears. "It is not Emma," she whispered. "It is another child." Mr. Whitman's voice was grave. "I told myself I might have imagined it. But here it is. Proof." She was not alone. Evelyn clutched the phone, her hands trembling so fiercely she feared she might drop it. Her heart pounded as if the truth itself had come pounding at her door. The next morning, unable to bear the weight of silence any longer, she returned to the police station. This time she brought not just Emma's drawings, but the video clip on Mr. Whitman's phone. Detective Harris sat across from her again, his expression skeptical until the moment she pressed play. Melissa appeared on the screen, her nervous glances unmistakable. The child stumbled beside her, small and fragile. Harris leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. For the first time, his composure faltered. "This could be a relative's child," he muttered, though the uncertainty in his tone betrayed him. Evelyn shook her head firmly. "Detective, I have lived in that neighborhood for decades. I know every family, every child. That little girl is not from our street." Before Harris could respond, a young officer entered with a file in his hands. "Sir, I think you should see this," he said. He laid the folder on the desk and flipped it open. Inside was a flyer, the kind Evelyn had seen tacked to bulletin boards, but had never wanted to study closely. A missing child report. Her breath caught as her eyes fell on the photograph. A small girl with bright eyes and a shy smile, her name printed in bold letters beneath. Sophie Miller, age 5, missing for 2 weeks from Fairview, a neighboring town. Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth. The resemblance was undeniable. Sophie's hair, her fragile build, the pajamas from the video, it was her. The girl in Emma's whispers. The girl behind the bars of those haunting drawings. Harris stared at the flyer, then back at the footage, his expression hardening. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the old fluorescent lights. "It matches," the young officer said quietly. For Evelyn, the world tilted. The pieces that had felt scattered now slammed together with terrifying clarity. Emma had not imagined anything. Melissa was not simply a grieving widow drowning in strange habits. There was another child, a missing child, and she was inside that house. Evelyn gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself, her voice breaking as she whispered, I told you she was real." At that moment, she no longer felt like the crazy old widow the neighborhood mocked. The truth had broken through the wall of silence. The weight she had carried alone was now undeniable. Yet even as relief surged through her veins, dread followed close behind. For if Sophie was truly in Melissa's basement, then every second counted. And Evelyn knew the fight was far from over. Evelyn Parker barely slept. The night after seeing the video from Mr. Whitman replayed in her mind again and again. Each grainy frame burned itself into her memory, Melissa glancing nervously over her shoulder, the frail child in thin pajamas stumbling beside her. No matter how Evelyn tried to steady her breathing, her chest ached with urgency. At dawn, she wrapped herself in a wool scarf, tucked Emma's drawings and Mr. Whitman's phone into her worn handbag, and walked to the bus stop. The cold morning air stung her cheeks, but she welcomed the sharpness. It gave her a sense of being alive, of carrying a mission larger than herself. This time she was not walking into the police station with whispers and fragile fears. She carried proof. The station looked the same as before: peeling paint, the smell of stale coffee, but to Evelyn it was no longer a place of dismissal. She marched straight to Detective Harris's office, her steps firmer than they had been days earlier. Harris looked up from his desk, his weary eyes widening slightly at the sight of her. "Mrs. Parker." "You are back." "Yes," Evelyn said, her voice steady. She placed the phone on his desk and tapped the screen to start the video. "And I am not leaving until you watch this." Harris leaned forward, the lines of skepticism deepening on his forehead as the footage played. But as Melissa appeared in the frame, dragging the small child into the shadows, his expression shifted. He paused the video, rewound it, and watched again. Then he picked up the missing child report his junior officer had shown him the day before. The photograph of Sophie Miller, bright-eyed, only 5 years old, seemed to stare at both of them. The resemblance was unmistakable. Harris exhaled slowly. "It matches," he admitted, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "It may not be enough for a conviction, but it is enough to request a warrant." For the first time, Evelyn felt her heart lift. The burden she had carried alone was beginning to shift onto broader shoulders. She clenched her hands in her lap, whispering, "Thank you, Detective." Before Harris could respond, a knock sounded at the office door. The young officer opened it, and behind him stood 2 neighbors. Linda, a woman with silver-streaked hair who sold baked goods at the local farmer's market, and Miguel, a retired mechanic often seen playing dominoes in front of the corner store. Evelyn stiffened, bracing for scorn, but their expressions were grave. Linda spoke first, her voice trembling. "Detective, I heard Evelyn came here about Melissa. I did not want to believe it, but..." She paused, glancing at Evelyn with a mixture of regret and solidarity. "We have heard things. At night, sobbing, muffled cries drifting across the street, more than once." Miguel nodded firmly. "And I saw light in her basement at odd hours, just before dawn. It is not normal. I did not think much of it before, but now..." He shook his head. "Now it makes sense." Evelyn's throat tightened. These were the same neighbors who had once whispered about her being delusional, who had turned their backs when Melissa spread her stories. Now they were standing in this office, lending their voices to hers. Detective Harris listened carefully, jotting notes, his face unreadable. Finally, he looked up. Multiple testimonies, corroborating details, and a missing child report. Combined with the footage, this is enough to justify action. I will contact the judge for a warrant immediately." Evelyn's hands trembled in her lap. Relief flooded her chest, mingled with fear of what they might discover. She looked at Linda and Miguel, gratitude shining in her tired eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought I was alone." Linda reached across the desk to touch Evelyn's hand. "We should have believed you sooner. Forgive us." Miguel's voice was gruff but sincere. "You were right to fight. You saved that little girl's life just by not giving up." Evelyn's eyes blurred with tears. For days, she had been the crazy widow, the lonely woman consumed by grief. But now, in this crowded office, she was something else entirely. She was the one who had refused to silence a child's cry. Detective Harris stood, his tone firm, decisive. "We will act swiftly. Mrs. Parker, I cannot promise what we will find, but I promise we will not ignore this." The words struck like a drumbeat in Evelyn's chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was not carrying the truth alone. The wall of silence had cracked, and light was pouring through. Outside, as she left the station, Evelyn felt the cold wind bite at her cheeks. But this time, it did not feel like a punishment. It felt like a summons. She pulled her scarf tighter and whispered to herself, "We are coming, Sophie. Hold on. Would you have the courage to keep fighting when no one believed you, only to see the truth finally come to light?" Share your thoughts below and join our community by subscribing for more stories that honor courage in the face of silence. The rain began before dawn, a cold, relentless drizzle that tapped against Evelyn's window as though warning her that this would not be an ordinary day. She dressed in silence, her hands trembling as she buttoned her coat. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wet asphalt and damp earth. When the first flash of blue patrol lights reflected across her living room wall, she knew the moment had come. Detective Harris stood by the lead car, his expression grim. His team of officers moved with quiet efficiency, their boots splashing in shallow puddles as they approached Melissa's modest house. Evelyn followed at a distance, her heart pounding, her scarf pulled tight around her neck. Every step toward that house felt like stepping deeper into a storm from which there would be no return. Melissa opened the door before the officers could knock. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with panic. For a brief moment, she tried to mask her fear with indignation. "What is this? You cannot just barge into my home," she snapped, her voice shrill and trembling. Harris held up the warrant. "We have legal authority. Please step aside." Melissa's composure shattered. She shook her head violently, her body pressed against the narrow hallway as though she could block them with sheer will. "There is nothing here. You are humiliating me because of her lies," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger toward Evelyn, who stood just beyond the porch. Behind Melissa, a heavy-set man rushed into view. Caleb, her younger brother, his shoulders broad and his eyes burning with fury. "This is private property," he growled. "You have no right to humiliate my sister like this." He moved to shield Melissa, his chest rising and falling with rage. Two officers stepped forward, their voices calm but firm. "Sir, step back. Do not interfere." But Caleb lunged, his voice roaring above the rain. "You will not open that door." His hands clenched into fists, his anger like an animal cornered. Within seconds, officers restrained him, pinning his arms as he thrashed and cursed. Melissa cried out, reaching for him, but her own body trembled too much to move. Harris's voice cut through the chaos, steady and commanding. "Search the house. Start with the basement." The officers moved quickly down the hallway, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. Melissa tried to follow, her voice cracking into sobs. "Please, you do not understand. She needed help. I was only trying." Her words dissolved into broken cries as an officer reached the end of the corridor and paused before a rusted iron door. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The house seemed to hold its breath too. Even the rain outside felt muffled, as if the world itself waited for the secret to be unveiled. The officer tested the handle. Locked. He exchanged a glance with Harris. Then, with a set of master keys and a firm twist, the lock gave way. The sharp metallic click echoed like thunder through the hallway. Melissa screamed, her voice raw. "Do not open it. Please, do not." But it was too late. The door groaned as it swung open, releasing a gust of damp, foul air that smelled of mildew and fear. Flashlights cut through the darkness, beams slicing across concrete walls and broken boxes. And then, from the far corner, a small figure staggered forward. Sophie. Her hair was tangled, her face pale beneath a layer of dust. She wore pajamas torn at the seams, her tiny body trembling with each step. Her left arm was wrapped in dirty bandages, stiff with dried blood and grime. She blinked against the sudden light, her wide eyes filled with terror and confusion. For a moment, no one moved. The sight was too raw, too unbearable. Evelyn pressed a hand to her chest as tears blurred her vision. Around her, neighbors who had gathered in the rain gasped audibly, their hands flying to their mouths. The woman they had called delusional was now vindicated before their very eyes. Sophie stumbled again, nearly collapsing, but a female officer rushed forward, scooping her into her arms. The little girl clutched an old, faded cushion as though it were the only thing tethering her to safety. Her small voice rose in a whimper that pierced every heart present. "It hurts. My hand hurts." The crowd outside broke into murmurs, shock rippling through the air. Linda clutched Miguel's arm, whispering, "My God, Evelyn was right all along." Others lowered their eyes in shame, unable to meet Evelyn's gaze. Melissa's scream rang out, high and broken. She threw herself toward the basement, but two officers restrained her. "I was protecting her. You do not understand," she sobbed, her voice unraveling. Caleb continued to thrash, his fury powerless against the grip of law enforcement. Detective Harris stood at the doorway, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on Sophie. He turned to his officers. "Call an ambulance. Now." His voice carried no doubt, only cold command. Evelyn's knees weakened, and she clutched the porch rail to keep from collapsing. Relief and sorrow flooded her in equal measure. Relief that Sophie was alive, sorrow for what the child had endured. She looked at Emma's drawings folded in her bag, at the whispered confession that had begun all of this. Her granddaughter's courage had opened the door, and now the world could no longer deny the truth. As Sophie was carried out into the rainy morning, neighbors parted silently, the weight of shame heavy on their shoulders. Evelyn stepped closer, her trembling hand reaching toward the child. She whispered, her voice breaking, "You are safe now, sweetheart." The girl's eyes fluttered toward her, fragile but alive. In that moment, Evelyn knew that everything she had endured, the ridicule, the isolation, the whispers of madness, had been worth it. The iron door had opened, and with it, the truth had burst into the light, undeniable and unforgiving. If this moment touched your heart, please share this video so more people will know that truth must always be protected. The days that followed were a blur of sirens, headlines, and questions that seemed to pour in from every direction. For Evelyn, each sunrise felt heavy with the weight of what had been uncovered. Melissa had been led away in handcuffs, her cries echoing in Evelyn's memory. At first, she had claimed desperation, insisted she was helping Sophie. But as investigators searched the house and uncovered journals filled with cryptic notes, they revealed ties to a small underground sect known for its twisted beliefs. Melissa had fallen into a world Evelyn could scarcely comprehend, a darkness that had swallowed the sweet daughter-in-law she once knew. News spread quickly. Television vans lined the street, reporters thrusting microphones toward Evelyn's porch. She said little. She had no interest in the spotlight. The only thing that mattered was Sophie, fragile but alive, and Emma, who had carried the secret no child should ever have to carry. The most powerful moment came 3 days later, in the children's ward of St. Mary's Hospital. Sophie's parents, the Millers, had arrived the night before after being contacted by police. Evelyn watched from the hallway as they rushed into Sophie's room, their arms wrapping around the little girl with desperate tenderness. The sobs that followed were not of fear, but of joy, the sound of a family stitched back together after nearly being torn apart. Mrs. Miller noticed Evelyn lingering at the doorway. Her face streaked with tears, she crossed the room and took Evelyn's trembling hands in her own. "We do not have words," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You and Emma, you saved our child. If not for you, I do not know what would have happened." Mr. Miller stepped forward, his voice steadier, but his eyes glistening. "You gave us back our daughter. That makes you family to us now." Evelyn felt tears spill freely. She had carried grief like a stone in her chest for so many years, missing her son David, aching for the family she once had. And now, though it could never replace him, life had placed a new bond in her hands. She squeezed theirs tightly, whispering, "It was not me. It was Emma. She was the brave one." Later that evening, back in Maplewood, Evelyn walked down her street and found neighbors gathered outside her gate. Faces she had once feared seeing, faces that had whispered against her, now looked at her with humility. Linda stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Evelyn, we owe you an apology. We doubted you when we should have listened. You were right all along." Miguel removed his cap, his weathered hands twisting it nervously. "Forgive us. We called you names. But what you did, you protected not just your family, but our entire community." Others murmured in agreement. Some had tears in their eyes. For once, the eyes upon Evelyn did not accuse. They respected. They honored. Emma stood beside her grandmother, clutching Mr. Buttons, her teddy bear worn thin but still sturdy in her small hands. Linda knelt to meet her gaze. "Emma, you are a little hero," she said softly. "It was your courage that saved Sophie. Never forget that." Emma's cheeks flushed, and she leaned into Evelyn's side, whispering, "I was so scared, Grandma." Evelyn wrapped her arms around her, holding her tightly. She bent down and whispered into her ear, her voice filled with pride and trembling emotion. "You are my warrior, my brave little soldier. You carried the truth when no one else would." Emma smiled through her tears, her small arms squeezing her grandmother's waist. It was the first true smile Evelyn had seen from her in many weeks, and it felt like the sun breaking through a long, relentless storm. The following Sunday, the church bells rang in Maplewood as the community gathered not for scandal, but for gratitude. Sophie's recovery was celebrated, Emma was praised as the little hero, and Evelyn was invited to speak. She stood slowly before the crowd, her voice quiet but steady. "We live in a world where silence can destroy lives," she said, "where fear keeps people from speaking truths that burn in their hearts. But today, we stand together because a child had the courage to whisper, and because some of us chose to listen. Do not think that age makes us weak. We, the elders, are keepers of the fire. We are here to protect, to guide, and to shield those who cannot yet stand on their own. If you remember nothing else, remember this: the truth is always worth defending, no matter the cost." The crowd was silent for a heartbeat, then applause rose like a wave, rolling through the pews and out into the quiet streets beyond. Evelyn bowed her head, humbled, but her heart was lighter than it had been in years. That night, back at home, she and Emma sat together on the porch beneath the red maple tree. The rain had cleared and the stars glimmered faintly above. Emma leaned against her grandmother's shoulder, her teddy bear nestled between them. "Grandma," she whispered, "do you think Daddy knows what happened?" Evelyn looked toward the heavens, her eyes glistening. "Yes, my love, he knows. And he is proud of you. Proud of us both." Emma smiled softly and closed her eyes, drifting into sleep. Evelyn held her close, the weight of the child warm against her side. For the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt peace. Not because the world was safe, there would always be darkness, but because she knew light still lived within her family, within her granddaughter, within herself. As she whispered into the night, she knew the truth. She was not a frail old woman, not a relic of the past. She was the guardian of her family, the keeper of the flame, and as long as she had breath, she would carry it. The last light had not gone out. It burned brighter than ever. In every story we share here, there is a piece of truth that belongs to all of us. Evelyn's journey reminds us that age does not weaken the heart. It sharpens our ability to see, to protect, and to carry light into the darkest corners. What happened to Sophie, to Emma, and to Evelyn's family is not only a story about pain and danger. It is a story about courage, about refusing to remain silent, and about the quiet power of those who are often overlooked. Perhaps you have lived through something similar. Perhaps you have carried a truth that others refused to hear, or maybe you have been the one to stand alone when the world turned away. Your voice matters. Your memories, your wisdom, and your resilience are part of a greater flame that keeps our families and our communities alive. We share these stories not to judge, but to remind one another that we are never truly alone. Somewhere, someone has walked through the storm you are facing. Somewhere, someone is waiting to hear that they are not forgotten. By telling these stories, by remembering them, we pass on strength from one generation to the next. If Evelyn's story touched your heart, let it be more than a moment. Share this video so that others may also be reminded of the courage that still exists in the world. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or share a piece of your own journey. You may be surprised by how many others are walking beside you, even from far away. And if you wish to continue receiving stories like this, stories that honor the dignity, the courage, and the enduring love of older generations, please like this video and subscribe to Grandma's Final Chapter. Each subscription, each share, each comment helps us bring more voices into the light. Life's final chapters are not about fading away, they are about shining brighter, together.